In the book of Revelation, there's this fantastic image. Revelation chapter 14, 15, 16, in that range. When God pulls back the veil and allows John, the revelator, to see the world through his eyes, John is able to see the spiritual realities that work in and under our world. So he sees the socio-economic political reality that governs the whole world, and it looks like the most beautiful woman he's ever seen, and her name is Babylon the Great. And this woman, what she's doing is no one can resist her. People from all over the nations are coming to her like sailors to a siren, right? And she's offering them all her wine. And as they come to her, they drink of her wine, and they're all just stumbling drunk, intoxicated under her sway, under her influence. They're like addicts. They just can't say no, and they keep drinking and drinking to their own destruction. And then finally in Revelation chapter 16 and following, God steps in. He's enraged that Babylon the Great is doing this to all the nations, to the people. So he takes her, holds her own mouth open, and forces her to drink her own wine until she collapses on herself. It is a fantastic, vivid image. So this got me thinking. If God were to let us see what John saw, if he were to let us have a view of the spiritual realities taking place in our world right now, in and under all the political, socio-economic realities of our world, what would America the Great look like through God's eyes? Or maybe more interesting, if America's global influence were to be described as an adult beverage, what exactly is in that concoction that has the whole world craving it? What is it in the American cocktail that has hundreds of millions, maybe billions of people jonesing for another hit? So, here's my shot at a recipe of what I would call the Great American Cocktail. This is just me imagining. Of course, I am not a prophet or an apostle, so I can't be sure what it would look like, but if I were to imagine what the American cocktail would be composed of, there's a few things that are really obvious. The first thing that would have to be the base of any good American cocktail, any classic, would be a big pour of what we call consumer economy. The consumer economy would have to be the basis of this. In some ways, this syrupy, sweet consumer economy that we live in is the American spirit. This is what makes America great, and this is what will make promises to make America great again. Now, listen, I'm not knocking it. I'm not a Marxist. I'm not a communist. But just like you, I love endlessly buying cheap and oh-so-trendy stuff at Target and pushing a button and having it delivered to my door the next day on Amazon. It is intoxicating. I love it. But let's at least recognize that America is built upon a system of endless wanting. So one of my favorite writers on this subject is an author named L.M. Sakasis. And he describes our consumer economy this way. He says, only by the perpetual creation of novel needs and desires, new needs and desires, can economic growth be sustained given how things presently operate. So just about every aspect of our culture is designed to make us think that happiness, or something like it, always lies on the other side of more. On the other side of more. Like, that's the phrase. That's it. Our consumer economy isn't just describing how we like to buy endless stuff made in China. Our consumer economy is a belief system. It's the belief that if I can get more stuff, more followers, more pleasure, more education, more experiences, more choices, just more, then I'll be happy. Then I'll be secure. Then I'll be somebody. You see, American consumerism, the consumer economy, and the American pursuit of happiness that's written into our Constitution. These they're like Thelma and Louise. They're like Bonnie and Clyde. They're like Death and Hades. They're inseparable. Like, you get one, you get the other. So fueled by our pursuit of happiness, seeking after happiness, the consumer economy will only stop when we are truly happy, which is to say, never. So have you seen the chart of the S&P 500 over the last 10 years? Here it is. It's tripled in the last 10 years. Now, this is not just a measure. What I'm suggesting is this is not just a measure of how American wealth has tripled. This is a measure of how American desires have tripled. More than any particular good or service, this is what the consumer economy produces: insatiable desires. That's how our economy keeps growing and growing. That's how we all get richer. That's how we save for retirement. That's how we employ hundreds of millions of workers all over the globe to fulfill our Amazon orders and fill our Target with stylish and oh so affordable stuff. In this way, the global economy is built upon the insatiable desires of us. If we all of a sudden became content, the global economy, as we know it, would collapse. Again, Secaucus says it this way: your contentment and mine would wreak havoc on the existing order of things. That's enough, thanks, is arguably a radical sentiment. So the first thing necessary, absolutely necessary to have this great American cocktail is a consumer economy. But the second thing that is equally important to this is freedom. Freedom, and I'm going to put this in quotations because I don't mean freedom as it's historically been defined or how philosophers defined it. I mean American freedom. I mean, I can do anything I want to do so long as it doesn't actually hurt anyone else. That kind of freedom. I mean the freedom that, to quote Justice Kennedy, Supreme Court decision from 1992, at the heart of liberty, freedom, is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. So that freedom that is usually reserved for God, the freedom to define the meaning of the universe, in America, you have that freedom. Your gifts and your abilities, they don't define you. Your body doesn't define you. Your family doesn't define you. God doesn't define you. You define you. Now that's intoxicating. So I take consumer economy, a big double shot of freedom, and then I'd spike it with hope. And I don't know if hope is quite the right word here, although Americans are famous for hope or optimism. I'm not talking about the hope that Jesus Christ brings. Now, I'm not talking about Christian hope. Christian hope is a hope that is hope in the face of hardship. Christian hope is the hope that doesn't avoid or eliminate suffering, but overcomes it. It says, I consider my present sufferings not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed in us. That because Jesus died and rose from the cross, I can face anything and know that that's my ultimate future. That's Christian hope. What I'm talking about here is more the myth of Prometheus. Do you know it? Prometheus Bound? So Prometheus was the god who came down to the Greeks and brought them two gifts. He took pity on these poor people who were suffering so miserable, the miserable humans, so he gave them two gifts. The first gift was blind hope. It's a hope that things will always get better. It's a hope that would make them forget about death. It's a hope that would make them numb to suffering, a hope that would make humans believe themselves to be gods. Now this is more the flavor of American hope. It's the belief that with enough time and money, there's nothing we can't overcome. It's the conviction that all sufferings can and should be avoided. It's a belief that allows us to get so lost in this life that we forget about that one little thing, death. Totally forget about it. So the second gift of Prometheus also might apply to this discussion here. It was fire, which is the most ancient form of technology, of ways of reshaping the world. So fire allowed the ancients to overcome nature. Not just keep warm in the winter, but allowed them to create like fired clay pots so they could store up their goods. It allowed them to work with metal so they could make tools and weapons and jewelry. It allowed them to overcome every other animal, every climate, every continent. So that's exactly what this American cocktail needs. After you take these ingredients, they need to be blended blend with big tech. They need some technology here. Now, I want to be clear here. Technology doesn't so much add anything extra to the mix. It's still just the good old-fashioned consumerism, freedom, blind hope. But technology so accelerates, so amplifies these old ingredients that it's as to make them something entirely new. Here's what I mean. A couple weeks ago, we talked about Alexander Solzhenitsyn's commencement speech at Harvard in 1978, and he said to them, "This American system, consumer economy, freedom, hope, it's creating this system of competition that fills every human thought with active, intense competition." That's what he said. It generates insatiable desires, driving us into a frenzy of activity and anxiety, and forces us to view life in terms of consumption, comparison, competition. He said that in 1978. So in 1978, if big business wanted to fill my thought with active, intense competition so I would buy more stuff, they had to fill my head with little jingles or billboards along the roadside. Today, big business harvests my personal data so they can feed it into unresting, non-human machines, AI, which will endlessly work until it finds my weakness and turns me into a commodity, selling off my attention to the highest bidder. A little different. 1978, if I wanted to compare my vacation to your vacation, to my neighbor's vacation, I actually had to invite them over and get out the slide projector and click, click. Here's Jenny at the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Click, click. Oh, that one's upside down. Today, I can get a instantaneous update of your glorious Caribbean vacation while I'm waiting in line at the DMV. In 1978, if I wanted to compare what you're having for dinner to what I'm having for dinner, we would actually have to have dinner together. Today, I can actually sit there, and while I'm eating cold pizza over the sink, I can doom scroll and look at every course of your fabulous dinner you're having at Zahav's. In 1978, if I wanted to look at porn, if I wanted to binge watch movies, if I wanted to have a really great pair of shoes, it was work. I had to go somewhere. I had to seek it out. I had to do something. Now, I can do all of this instantaneously, anonymously, alone, in my room, on my smartphone. So it's the same old stuff, same old principles, amplified and accelerated. And now, if we take this cocktail and we pour it in here, and then we want to make it, of course, if we're Christian, we're evangelical American, then we would want to garnish this with Jesus. And there's the great American cocktail. You have one enticing, addictive, intoxicating cocktail. It tastes amazing, but then the buzz fades, and we need another drink, and another drink, and another drink, until we find ourselves vomiting up stress, anxiety, depression, relational dysfunction, suicidal ideation, until we find ourselves addicted, like the pleasure's gone, but we keep doing the same stuff, until we find our lives filled with the low hum of constant anxiety, insecurity, creeping loneliness, a need to numb, a need to prove ourselves, a compulsion for more, a restlessness, a desire for something just beyond our reach. So if you read the rest of Prometheus' story, see, it didn't work out so well for him. He ends up chained to some remote cliffside in the middle of nowhere, and an eagle comes during the day, picks at his liver, and then at night it grows back, and then the next day the eagle comes again, and so on forever and ever. Amen. Which makes me think, how's this going to work out for America? And just to clarify, I love America. I am not a Marxist commie. I'm pro-America. I don't say this because I hate America. I say this because I love America. But, and it could just be me, it doesn't seem like a stretch of the imagination to think that we might just be living in America's Revelation 16 moment. like God's holding our mouths open and forcing us to drink this great American cocktail until we collapse upon ourselves. I don't know. I could be wrong. I hope I am. But whatever we make of this, I'm pretty sure that we could all use some help sobering up from this normal American life, from this American way of doing things, from this American way of seeing things. So here's a question I want to explore today as we move forward. How do we break our addiction to this American way of life, to this great American cocktail? How do we, who've been immersed in American culture, who've been drinking this American cocktail since we were using sippy cups, how do we break our addiction to this? How do we find the inner freedom to match our outer freedom? How do we find the spiritual freedom to match our legal freedom? So today we're continuing the series on the biblical command to Sabbath. Sabbath in Hebrew just means rest or cease. So last week we saw that Sabbath lies at the very heart of life with God. That it is literally at the heart of the Ten Commandments, between the two tablets of the space we need to love God and love others. Sabbath sits at the middle of that. We describe Sabbath as entering into a different space, into a palace in time, what Eugene Peterson calls a grace-filled country, where everything we experience is a gift from God by grace alone, where we don't have to work to achieve anything, because it's already been given to us. We can just be loved by God, cherished by God. We're invited by God to delight in Him, to delight in others, to delight in creation. And it is all good, tov, tov. And that is all true. But today, we're going to explore the other side of the Sabbath experience. So if last week God was making a too much chocolate cake and He put the ganache on and drizzled it with raspberry sauce and then served it up with some whipped cream and invited us over to eat it. Oh, it's so good. If that's what last week was like, this week is a bit like drinking a big cup of orange juice after you brush your teeth. That's what Sabbath is like. It ruins our taste for this American cocktail. Instead of endless wanting, we're called to be content. Instead of limitless freedom, we're called to embrace limits. Instead of blind hope, we're called to find our hope in God alone. Instead of having every thought filled with distraction and anxiety, we are called to be fully present with God and others. And as wonderful as this might sound, Sabbath is as pleasant to most Americans as detox is to most addicts. Because Sabbath is a direct affront to the American way of life. It's not something we add to the normal American life. It's resistance against the normal American life. It is not just an invitation to delight in God. It's an invitation to join the resistance. It's a declaration to the God of this world. You have no authority over me. Your threats don't scare me. You can't control me. I am not your slave. I am a child of God. So in order to go where we need to go today, let's go back to the story that informs our stories in the book of Exodus. So we said from week 1, 3,500 years ago, really real historic story, happened in space and time. God's people were enslaved to a king, Pharaoh, who believed himself to be the God of this world. And the God of this world turned these people, made in the image of God, into slaves. He devalued them, dehumanized them. Their only identity was what they could produce for him. In Pharaoh's world, you're only as good as what you produce. In Pharaoh's world, you can never rest. So then Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, shows up and He invites them to stop working, to just be His children, to be with Him, to be in relationship with Him, to enjoy the world that He created for them, to reflect His image. But when He does this, the God of this world, Pharaoh, does everything in his power to keep them enslaved. But God's not deterred. He sends down these 10 spectacular plagues onto Egypt and defeats Pharaoh, sets his people free, and we call this whole thing the Exodus. So today, I want to tease out yet one more piece of this, something that we've been hinting at all along the way. When Moses shows up to Pharaoh and says, "The Lord says to you, 'Let my people go.' And then Pharaoh replies, 'Who's the Lord?' 'I don't know the Lord.' This is not some political discussion here. This is not a debate over ideologies or socioeconomics. This isn't a debate over like OSHA violations or healthcare benefits for his employees. This is the gods of Egypt versus the gods of Abraham, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So in the 10 plagues, the Lord isn't just ruining their economy or their political system. He is, listen to this, he is mocking and killing the gods of Egypt one by one. For example, Hapi, god of the Nile, who provides water, food, jobs for all of Egypt. He turns it into blood. Heket, the frog-headed god, who holds the keys to life after death. He makes frogs cover everything, and then he kills them. Ra, the sun god, who gives light and life. He darkens. So you get the idea. Yes, this is a socio-political, economic pandemonium that he's creating. It is like shutting off Google for a week or like causing a nationwide power outage. But this isn't just socio-political or economic. It is personal. So in Exodus chapter 12, kind of this key verse at the 10th plague, the moment God's saving them, he says, on that same night, referring to the 10th plague, the Passover, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. To hear this, he's not proposing a $15 an hour minimum wage or a new political structure. He's killing their gods. This is violent, this is radical, this is revolutionary, and this is the basis of Sabbath. It's not just a call to delight in God, it's a call to join the resistance. So according to Moses and Jesus and the Apostle Paul and others in the Scriptures, the political, economic, social, educational, ideological, religious systems of our world are not just human ideas, but in and under and behind these ideologies are unseen but quite real forces, spiritual forces. Which is to say, Pharaoh might be long dead, but the God of this world, he just takes on a new name. Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, America. Today, we have a different vocab, right? We would say democracy, socialism, capitalism, Marxism, liberalism, conservatism, critical race theory, evangelicalism, pretty much anything with an ism at the end. But we're talking about the same things here. When the Apostle Paul says in Ephesians chapter 6, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood. It's not against this stuff, but against the rulers, the authorities, against the powers of this dark world and against the spiritual forces. Or in Galatians 4, when he says, formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods. He is talking about spiritual forces here. He's talking about Satan, demons, personified evil in and under and behind the unseen but extremely powerful forces of our socioeconomic political world. Now, I recognize that many of us have no category for personified evil. If we can't see it, it's hard to place in our world. So this would require a much longer conversation for me to try and even attempt to create space in your minds for how do we think about this. For today's purposes, I just want to lay out three observations that come straight out of the Scriptures that hopefully we aren't too much up for grabs. The first is this. According to the Scriptures, like Moses and Jesus and the Apostle Paul, the unseen socioeconomic political forces that shape our world are not merely human ideas. I think we can all agree on that. According to the Bible, these are spiritual realities. Personified evil and good and evil are behind these things, shaping these things. Number two, these spiritual realities are the primary way in which the God of this world, a reference to Satan, seeks to enslave us. So in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul refers to the God of this world. He blinds people to the truth of the gospel. Revelation 16, John sees Babylon the Great. She's getting the whole world drunk on her wine. This is a spiritual reality under a socio-political force. In today's secular language, we could say it like this. Our socio-economic political realities always tend towards dehumanization, exploitation, anxiety, fear, restlessness, and the like. Number 3, and this is where I want to camp out today. Sabbath is an act of resistance against the God of this world. Sabbath is a call to break our addiction to what this world is serving up. Sabbath is an invitation to join the resistance and to declare, I am no longer a slave, I am a child of God. So, when God, getting back to the story here, when God sets the Israelites free from Egypt, they are immediately free, physically separated from Egypt. Pharaoh is gone, but spiritually, they still think and act and feel and desire like a slave. Their hearts are still shaped by Egyptian culture, by the way they've been dehumanized, by all the things they've experienced. They're carrying their past with them. So now, he doesn't need to just take them out of Egypt. He needs to take Egypt out of them. We pick up the story today, and we'll spend the rest of the day here if you want to turn with me. It's Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16. Now here's the question. These Israelites have been immersed in Egyptian culture their whole lives. They have been drinking Pharaoh's cocktail since they were using sippy cups. So how do they break free from their addiction? How does God give them the inner freedom to match their physical, external freedom? Exodus chapter 16, starting in verse 1. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. So pick up this detail. It's the 15th day of the second month. So they came out of Egypt on the 15th day of the first month, which was Passover. So on that day, it had been a whole month since they had left Egypt, and they haven't had any food. Look at verse 2. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. So get what's happened here. God takes them out of their slavery, and immediately they long to return to their slavery. So what does God do? He takes them, and rather than immediately just trading off one pleasure for the next, instead he brings them into the middle of the desert, a place where they cannot meet their own needs, a place where if God himself does not provide, they will literally die. And I want you to appreciate the contrast here that we're going to see between Pharaoh's world and God's world. According to Pharaoh, in his realm, in his kingdom, the only way to have security is to endlessly store up more. You might recall that he was the wealthiest man in the world, but what did he have these Israelites doing as his slaves? Building storehouses. Because what the wealthiest man in the world needs is more stuff. It's laughable. It's supposed to be. This is how the world seeks security and satisfaction, through more. Happiness, security. What I'm really seeking is always on the other side of more. So, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells a story, Luke chapter 12, where he says, there's this rich man, and he brings in so much crops that year, so much that he doesn't know what to do with it all. So he's like, it won't all fit in my barn. I know what I'll do. I will tear down my barn, and I will build bigger barns, and then I'll enjoy everything in my life. Then I'll have security. Then I'll be happy. Then it's just on the other side of more. That's what I'm really looking for in life. But God says to that man, according to Jesus, you fool, you're going to die. Then who's going to get all your stuff? Don't miss this. Pharaoh is the original fool. He is the wealthiest man in the world who is endlessly building store cities thinking that he'll find security and happiness in them. But instead, he drowns an anxious, unhappy, insecure man. So in order to teach the Israelites to trust him, to trust God with their security, with their happiness, to stop seeking it the way Pharaoh seeks it, to stop seeking it the way America seeks it, he leads them to a place where they cannot store anything because there's nothing to store. Verse 4. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. Like, I'm going to rain down bread from heaven. Now, are you going to trust me? Or are you still going to act like Pharaoh's ruling over you? Are you going to trust me to provide for you? Or are you going to store up as much as you can, hoard and hoard and hoard, and try and create your own security? In verses 6 and 7, Moses turns around, tells the Israelites about this. Watch his word choice here. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, in the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, and in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumblings against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us? And we need to hear the wording he says here. In the morning you will see the glory of the Lord. This is fantastic. This is what Moses saw up on the mountain. Then he came down and his face was like beaming with lights. This is what the Apostle Paul says. When we see the glory of the Lord, we are transformed. We become like him. Just seeing his glory transforms us. So how will the God's people see the glory of the Lord? And the answer in this text is bread. They will see the glory of the Lord. Their lives will be transformed. Their lives will be beaming in their daily bread. They will see his glory in the way he meets their most basic, dare I say, boring needs, day after day. Verse 13. In the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp, and when the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared in the desert. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. In Hebrew, it's a little bit more interesting. They literally come up and say, manhu, which is like, what is it? And they're like, manna, bread, manna, which roughly translates, what's it? And then we go down to verse 31, skipping down to verse 31, we actually get a description of what this bread was like. It says, the people of Israel called the bread manna. What's it? And it was white like coriander seed, tasted like wafers made with honey. We really have no concept of what this is. It sounds like something that would be served like at a baby shower with like, that cream cheese with raspberry sauce on it or something. I don't know. I'm imagining it's gluten-free though. Whatever this manna is, we don't know. Nobody knows for sure. But God is not super interested in telling us about the manna. However, what he does seem super interested in is how the Israelites are to gather this manna. He spends 20 verses in this chapter detailing in great detail, great specificity, how this manna was to be collected. I'll summarize and drop into a few places here. In verse 16, he tells them, take as much as you need, as much as you want. But then in verse 17 and 18, he says, some gathered much, some gathered little. The one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Do you hear that? In Pharaoh's kingdom, it was never enough. Never enough. It's a world where some have more than they could ever use in a lifetime, and others are starving to death. But it's never enough for either. In God's kingdom, well, the one who gathered much didn't have too much, and the one who gathered little didn't have too little. It was enough. In verse 19, Moses tells them, you cannot keep it overnight. You are not supposed to keep it overnight. But then in verse 20, we find that some tried to do it anyways. However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until the morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. So get this, God is saying, you cannot store this up. I'm only going to provide one day at a time, your daily bread. You cannot store any up. And why? Think about this in terms of how God is breaking them, detoxing them, breaking their addiction to Pharaoh's world. Why? Because as soon as you start storing up stuff, you might begin to think that you don't need God to provide for you. You might place your security in your wealth, or your ability to work, or in your relationship with someone who has lots of wealth, rather than God. As soon as you start storing up, some might have more and some might have less, and you might start to view other people as competition, as people who just want your stuff, or people whose stuff you want. But that's not the way life is in God's kingdom. That might be what it was like under Pharaoh. That might be what it's like in America. That might be what it's like under the God of this world, but not in the grace-filled country. In that space where God rules, everything's gift. People are not competition. They are brothers, sisters, we're family. So then in verse 21 and 22, we see that, however, every day you're supposed to get just enough, but then on the last day of the week, it's a little different. The sixth day, rather. On the sixth day, it's different. On that day, we're to gather double. Watch this. He explains. He said to them, tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath, rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning. 6 days you're together, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will not be any. So do you hear this? Even before God gives them the Ten Commandments, remember the Sabbath, the fourth commandment, he is training them to practice the Sabbath. He's training them to prepare ahead of time, pick up double on the sixth day. He's training them to step out of Pharaoh's world, not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, mentally. So, how does God break them free from their addiction? How does he give them inner freedom? How does he build into them inner freedom to match their physical freedom? He calls them to be content. There will be enough. He calls them to embrace limits. That 6 days you're together, that's great. But there's limits to our work. And there's limits to our wealth. And there's limits. What you're seeking in life is not on the other side of more. If you can't find delight in God and others and creation today, you will never find it on the other side of more. You'll never find it. The kingdom of God, the grace-filled country, the delight that you're seeking in life can only be received as a gift. That's the only way to enter into it. If you try to achieve it, you'll ruin it. So he calls them to be content. He calls them to embrace their limits. He calls them to find their hope in him. You can't endlessly store up. You can't numb yourself with activity. You can't live in the illusion that you're a God who will overcome all your own problems. You must trust him. And then lastly, he calls them to put away all work, all distractions, and be fully present with him and others. There's literally no work to do on that day. You can go out and pick up bread if you want, but there's nothing out there. And this is how God is building into their hearts true freedom. Freedom from endless wanting, from the myth of limitless freedom, from blind hope, from a world in which every thought is filled with anxiety. And do you see what God is doing here? He's making Sabbath into a mini Exodus. That each week, he's going to reenact what he's already done for them. He's inviting them to participate in what he's already done in defeating and judging the gods of Egypt. On Sabbath, you and I are invited to mock and kill the gods of this world. The gods of consumerism, of insatiable desire, they're dead. The gods of achievement and creating your own value, they disappear. The gods of numbing and escapism, they have no place there. The gods of anxious production, of distraction, of restlessness, they're put away, turned off, gone. The Sabbath is an invitation to join the resistance. It's a call to break our addiction to what this world is serving up. Sabbath is a declaration to the God of this world, you have no authority over me. Your threats don't scare me. You don't control me. I am no longer a slave. I'm a child of God. And then in verse 32 and following, Moses then instructs him, now take some of this manna, and I want you to set it in the Ark of the Covenant, the same ark that's going to hold Aaron's staff and the Ten Commandments, because this lesson is as fundamental as the Ten Commandments. That with each and every Sabbath for all time, God is calling his people to join him in mocking and killing the gods of this world, to remember that they have no power, they cannot give you what you're truly seeking in life. The Sabbath is a choice. It's a declaration. It's a pledge of allegiance. I am not a slave. I am a child of God. I will not serve the gods of this world. I choose to trust in God, to receive life as gift, to walk in that grace-filled country. So what does this mean for us? Like, how do we break our addiction to this American way of life? How do we, who have been immersed in American culture, who've been drinking this American cocktail since we were using sippy cups, how do we break our addiction and find an inner freedom to match our outer external legal freedom? So let's get practical here. The first thing is, if you want to enjoy that type of Sabbath freedom, it's probably going to require prep work. Remember, the Israelites had to gather twice as much on the last day. So here's the question. What do you need to do ahead of time in order to step away from work, busyness, the demands and pressures of this world? Like, what do you need to prepare in advance so that you can be allowed to step into that? That's the first really practical thing. And then the second thing is this. The way we participate in Sabbath is not just delighting in God. On Sabbath, we are invited to join God in mocking and killing the gods of this world. And the way we do this is by telling them no. It's by declaring, you can't tell me what to do. You don't own me. I'm not your slave. So what gods do you need to mock and kill? What gods demand your time, your attention, demand that you get back to work, that you achieve something, that you numb yourself? What gods whisper to you that happiness and security and what you're really seeking is on the other side of more? What gods are speaking into your life that you need to step out of, and on Sabbath you need to kill because they need to die and Jesus wants you to kill them? So let me be careful here. I'm trying to measure my words. The danger here, we're talking about setting hard limits in our life so that we can experience God, so that we can step into Sabbath, so that we can experience the gospel. The danger here is that we can become legalistic with this and say, for me, Sabbath means the gods of work have no place here, therefore I can never work on Sabbath. And I think that's great, right? But the danger here is that we become legalistic with it. So the Old Testament Jews, they took this, and then at least from the time of Ezra on, they took it and they wrote out 39 definitions of work. And they had this list of all the things that were forbidden. So even to this day, Orthodox Jews won't tear their toilet paper on the Sabbath day because that breaks the rule of the tearing rule. And they won't push a button on the elevator. The elevators have to stop at every single floor because that breaks the pushing a button rule. Now, I believe there's a word for this. Theological word for this is dumb. That's dumb. That is not the heart of this. This is not about following arbitrary laws or rules or setting up arbitrary limits in our lives. This is about living into the reality that I'm no longer a slave. The gods of this world have no power over me, and I am a child of God. So when we ask these questions, like, what are the gods you need to kill? How do you break your addiction? I can't answer this for you. But there are some general things that you should consider. Like anything that sniffs of work or anxious productivity, maybe that needs to be killed. Technologies that numb or distract, that probably need to be kicked out of your Sabbath. Anything that stirs in you a desire for more as opposed to contentment probably needs to be off limits. So here's your assignment for this week. Last week it was about finding the things that stir your heart, that you can delight in God and others in creation. This week it's figuring out where those limits are. What are the gods you need to kill so that you can enjoy the freedom? So here's a list of questions I want you to consider this week as you process and try and come up with what are the limits God is calling you to set in your life. Question 1. What work do you need to stop doing? I can't answer that for you. For me, it's busy work. It's going to be emails. It's going to be writing sermons even. But for you, it might look totally different. For me, it's not work necessarily to work with wood or to build something or do something. That's actually great rest for me. For you, that might be anxious productivity. But what work do you need to stop doing? What draws you or sucks you into the world of insecurity, anxiety, and insatiable desire? What makes you believe that security or happiness, what you really want in life, is on the other side of more? What numbs you rather than makes you more aware and more fully present? Here's what I want you to do this week. Take those questions, make a list. Just like we did last week. Last week was the list of things you delight in. This week, what are the gods of this world that you need to kill? And then I want you to think about when you step into Sabbath, when you come to Sabbath, how do you ritually want to kill them? So maybe it's the god of anxiety that your cell phone produces, and so you ritually, the night before your Sabbath, you shut off your cell phone, you put it away in a drawer, and it's done for the week, and that is you saying that God has no power over me. What's your way of ritually putting down these gods for the Sabbath time? And then I want you to think about doing that. How do you do that in such a way that is not just an activity that is disassociated from God, but how do you couple with that the declaration, you don't own me. I am not a slave anymore. I am a child of God. And somewhere in there, you don't find a legalistic attitude, but it allows you to step into a new freedom, to break the addiction, to enjoy God the way we're called to enjoy. Good luck with this week. And next week, we'll follow this up with how do we love people more. See you next week.